The radio crackled with urgency as Flight 447 declared an emergency, but nobody in the airport was listening to the old taxi driver, who kept saying he could help. They saw Harold Morrison the same way everyone did, a 67-year-old man in a worn Yankees cap and a faded flannel shirt, driving the same beat-up Crown Victoria for the past 8 years. Just another aging cabbie trying to make rent. What they didn't know was that Captain Harold Maverick Morrison had logged over 8,000 flight hours in F-14 Tomcats, had landed on aircraft carriers in storms that would terrify commercial pilots, and had never lost a wingman in 200 combat missions. Some skills don't fade with age. They just wait for the right moment to save lives. Welcome to those who left a trace. Before we dive into this incredible story of hidden expertise and second chances, tell me in the comments, from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe that true heroes come in the most unexpected packages, hit that subscribe button. These stories need to be heard, and every subscription helps us honor the quiet legends walking among us. Harold Morrison's day started like every other day for the past 8 years. The alarm clock buzzed at 4:30 a.m. in his studio apartment above Luigi's Pizza on the south side of Chicago. The place smelled permanently of oregano and disappointment, but the rent was cheap and the location put him close to O'Hare International Airport, where most of his fares originated. At 67, Harold moved with the careful precision of a man whose body had absorbed decades of punishment but refused to admit defeat. His morning routine never varied. Instant coffee, 2 pieces of toast, a quick check of the weather, and a glance at the aviation news websites that he told himself he read out of idle curiosity, nothing more. By 5:45 a.m., Harold was behind the wheel of his 2009 Crown Victoria, a former police cruiser that he'd bought at auction and converted into Chicago's least impressive taxi. The car had 347,000 miles on it, a radio that worked when it felt like it, and seats that had absorbed the stories of 10,000 strangers. But it was his, and it provided just enough income to keep him fed, and housed a city that had no particular use for aging Navy veterans. Harold's first fare of the day was always the same. Margaret Chun, a nurse at Northwestern Memorial, who worked the night shift and needed a ride home to Chinatown. Margaret was one of the few people who treated Harold like a human being rather than just a service provider, and their brief morning conversations were often the highlight of his day. "Morning, Harold," Margaret said as she settled into the back seat, her scrubs wrinkled from 12 hours of saving lives. "How's the taxi business treating you?" Harold adjusted his rearview mirror and pulled away from the hospital. "Can't complain, Mrs. Chun. Still vertical. Still moving. That's something." Margaret smiled. She'd been riding with Harold for 3 years and had learned not to push when he deflected personal questions with humor. There was something about the old taxi driver that suggested depths he preferred to keep hidden. The way he scanned traffic patterns like he was conducting surveillance, the precision of his parallel parking, the calm competence with which he handled aggressive drivers and difficult passengers. "You ever think about retiring, Harold? You've been driving this route longer than most people stay at any job." Harold's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the steering wheel. Retirement. As if 8 years of driving taxi hadn't already been a kind of retirement from the life he'd really lived. "What would I do with myself, Mrs. Chun? Sit in a rocking chair and watch game shows? This keeps me busy, keeps me useful." What Harold didn't tell Margaret was that every morning, after he dropped her off in Chinatown, he drove past O'Hare International Airport and allowed himself exactly 5 minutes to sit in the taxi staging area and watch the planes take off. Boeing 737's, Airbus A320s, the occasional military transport. He could identify them all by sound before he even saw them. And for those 5 minutes, Harold Morrison, the taxi driver, would remember what it felt like to be Captain Harold Morrison, naval aviator, when the sky had been his domain, and he'd been one of the best pilots in the world. Then he'd start his radio, check for fares, and spend the rest of the day pretending that the closest he'd ever come to aviation was watching Top Gun on television. Harold's second fare of the morning was a corporate type heading to O'Hare for a business flight. The man was already on his phone when he climbed into back seat, talking loudly about quarterly projections and market penetration, while completely ignoring Harold's existence. No, Steve, you don't understand the Chicago market. These people are still living in the past. No innovation, no vision. It's like they're afraid of progress. Harold navigated the morning traffic with practiced efficiency, taking surface streets to avoid the construction on the Kennedy Expressway. After 30 years of military precision and 8 years of Chicago traffic, he could get anyone anywhere in the city faster than their GPS could calculate the route. "Excuse me, driver," the businessman said, finally acknowledging Harold's presence. "Can you turn up the heat? It's freezing back here." "Heat's already on, sir. Old car, old heating system. Does its best." The man sighed dramatically. "Of course it is. Look, I'm flying to Los Angeles for a presentation that could make or break my career. I can't afford to show up looking like I just crawled out of some ancient taxi. Can't you drive something from this century?" Harold's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "I apologize for the inconvenience, sir. We'll have you to the airport in 15 minutes. 15 minutes? My GPS says 12. Are you sure you know where you're going?" This time, Harold didn't respond. In his rear-view mirror, he could see the businessman typing aggressively on his phone, probably writing a negative review that would add to the collection Harold had been accumulating from passengers who expected limousine service at taxi prices. The businessman continued his phone conversation, his voice growing more animated as they approached the airport. "And another thing, Steve, the service industry in this city is a joke. I mean, look at this guy driving me. Probably been doing the same job for 40 years. No ambition, no drive. These people just accept mediocrity." Harold pulled into the departure area at Terminal 3 and stopped at the curb. The fare was $47.50. The businessman threw $50 at Harold without looking and climbed out of the taxi while still talking on his phone. "What I'm saying is, some people are born to be leaders and others are born to drive taxis. It's just the natural order of things." As the businessman walked away toward the terminal, Harold sat in his taxi for a moment, looking at the $50 bill. No tip, of course, but that wasn't what bothered him. What bothered him was a casual dismissal, the assumption that anyone driving a taxi must be there because they'd failed at everything else. Harold Morrison had never failed at anything in his life. He graduated from the Naval Academy with honors, had been selected for a fighter pilot training, had completed Top Gun, and had spent 15 years as one of the Navy's most skilled aviators. He'd flown combat missions over Iraq during Desert Storm, had served as a test pilot for new fighter aircraft, and had trained the next generation of naval aviators at facilities that most people didn't even know existed. But that was a lifetime ago, buried under years of civilian life, and the kind of quiet anonymity that military veterans often preferred after decades of service. Now he was just Harold the taxi driver, and most people assumed that was all he'd ever been. Harold was reaching for his radio to check for the next fare when the emergency began. The first sign was the unusual radio chatter from the airport control tower, which Harold had learned to monitor during his slow periods. Commercial aviation frequencies weren't supposed to be interesting, but old habits died hard, and Harold's trained ear automatically processed the background communications that most people ignored. United 447, Chicago approach. Turn left heading 270. Descend and maintain 3000. Chicago approach. United 447. We have a medical emergency in the cockpit. Captain is unconscious. First officer is... Oh God, he's not responding either. We need immediate assistance. Harold's head snapped up from his logbook. Medical emergency in the cockpit meant both pilots were incapacitated in a commercial airliner with passengers. The radio crackled again, and this time Harold could hear the panic in the flight attendant's voice. Chicago approach, United 447. We have 127 souls on board, and I don't know how to fly this plane. Please, we need help immediately. Harold was already moving, his muscle memory taking over, as years of emergency procedures and crisis management overrode 8 years of civilian passivity. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911 while simultaneously starting his taxi and heading toward the airport's operational area. 911, what's your emergency? This is Harold Morrison. I'm at O'Hare International Airport. There's a commercial airliner with both pilots incapacitated and 127 passengers on board. United Flight 447. They need immediate assistance. Sir, are you airport personnel? No, Harold hesitated for a fraction of a second. I'm a taxi driver, but I'm also a retired Navy pilot with over 8,000 flight hours. I can help. The 911 operator's response was predictable. Sir, I need you to stay clear of the airport operational areas. Emergency services are responding to the situation. Harold disconnected the call and continued driving toward the restricted area of the airport. Through his windshield, he could see United Flight 447 in the distance. A Boeing 737 making erratic turns and altitude changes as whoever was trying to control the aircraft struggled with systems they didn't understand. Harold parked his taxi at the security checkpoint and approached the guard station. The TSA agent on duty looked up with a weary expression of someone who dealt with confused passengers all day. Sir, this is a restricted area. You need to... I'm Captain Harold Morrison, United States Navy, retired. There's a commercial airliner up there with both pilots incapacitated, and I'm qualified to help. I need immediate access to the control tower. The TSA agent blinked. Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification. And even if you are who you say you are, I can't just let civilians into... Listen to me very carefully, Harold said, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that he hadn't used in 8 years but had never forgotten. In approximately 10 minutes, that aircraft is going to run out of fuel or crash into something, and 127 people are going to die. I am the only person currently available who has the skills to prevent that from happening. You can either help me save those lives, or you can explain to their families why you followed protocol instead of doing what was right. Something in Harold's tone and bearing must have communicated the seriousness of the situation, because the TSA agent reached for his radio. Control, this is Gate 7. I have a man here claiming to be a retired Navy pilot who says he can help with the United emergency. The response was immediate. Send him up. Now. The control tower at O'Hare International Airport was a symphony of controlled chaos when Harold arrived. Air traffic controllers worked multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, while emergency vehicles staged on the runways below, and airport management personnel coordinated with federal authorities. In the center of it all, a supervisor named Janet Kowalski was trying to establish communication with United Flight 447 while managing the crisis that was unfolding in real time. United 447 Chicago Tower, can you hear me? We need you to respond immediately. The voice that came back over the radio was clearly not a pilot. It was a flight attendant, probably in her 20s, trying to maintain composure while dealing with a situation she'd never been trained for. Chicago Tower, this is Sarah Mitchell, senior flight attendant on United 447. Both our pilots are unconscious. The captain collapsed about 10 minutes ago, and the first officer went down trying to help him. I don't know what's wrong with them, but they're not responsive. I have no idea how to fly this plane. Harold stepped forward, and his presence in the control tower was immediately noticed by everyone in the room. His Yankees cap and flannel shirt marked him as clearly not being airport personnel, but the way he carried himself and the confidence with which he approached the radio console suggested someone with authority and experience. Ma'am, I'm Harold Morrison. I'm a retired Navy pilot, and I'm here to help you get that aircraft on the ground safely. Can you tell me your current altitude and heading? Janet Kowalski started to object. Sir, you can't just... Ma'am, Harold said, turning to face the tower's supervisor with the kind of calm intensity that stopped arguments before they started. I have 8,000 flight hours in military aircraft, including 200-plus carrier landings in conditions that would ground commercial aviation. That flight attendant has about 15 minutes before she either runs out of fuel or loses control completely. We can discuss my credentials after we save 127 lives." Janet hesitated for exactly 2 seconds before handing Harold the radio microphone. "Sarah, this is Captain Morrison. I need you to take a deep breath and listen to my voice. You're going to be fine, and we're going to get everyone home safely. Can you tell me what you see out the cockpit window?" Sarah's voice came back shaky but determined. "Captain Morrison, I can see the ground, but we're bouncing around a lot. The plane keeps making these beeping sounds, and there are red lights flashing on the panel. That's the autopilot disconnect warning, and probably some altitude alerts. Sarah, I need you to sit in the left seat. That's the captain's seat, and put on the headset. Can you do that for me?" "Aye, yes. I'm moving to the left seat now." "Oh, God, Captain Morrison, this is so scary. There's so many buttons and switches. I don't know what any of this means." Harold's voice became more calm and reassuring, drawing on decades of experience in training new pilots and managing crisis situations. "Sarah, you don't need to know what all those switches do. I'm going to talk you through this step by step, and we're going to land this aircraft together. First, I need you to look at the instrument panel directly in front of you. You should see a large circular display with numbers that are changing. That's your altitude indicator. What number do you see?" "It says 4,200, and it keeps changing." "Good. Now look to the right of that. You should see another circular display with a pointer that looks like an airplane. That's your attitude indicator. Is the little airplane symbol level, or is it tilted?" "It's tilted to the right, and the background is half blue and half brown." Harold nodded grimly. The aircraft was in a descending right turn, which meant it was gradually losing altitude and heading toward an uncontrolled spiral. Without correction, Flight 447 would impact the ground in less than 10 minutes. "Sarah, I need you to find a wheel in front of you. It looks like a steering wheel in a car, but it's called a yoke. Put your hands on it gently. Don't grab it tight." "Okay, I have it. Now, very gently, turn the yoke to the left and pull back slightly. The goal is to make that little airplane symbol on the attitude indicator level again." Harold watched through the control tower windows as United Flight 447's erratic flight path began to stabilize. Sarah was doing exactly what he'd instructed, and the aircraft was responding. For the first time since the emergency began, Harold allowed himself to believe that this might actually work. "Captain Morrison, the little airplane is level now, and the plane feels more stable." "Outstanding, Sarah. You're doing great. Now we need to set up for an approach to the airport. I'm going to walk you through this step by step, and I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. I trust you." For the next 20 minutes, Harold Morrison transformed from a taxi driver back into the naval aviator he'd always been. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had landed fighter jets on aircraft carriers in the middle of storms, who had completed impossible missions in hostile territory, who had never lost a wingman or failed to bring his aircraft home. Step by step, Harold talked Sarah through the process of flying a commercial airliner. He guided her through altitude changes, heading corrections, airspeed management, and the complex sequence of procedures required to configure a Boeing 737 for landing. Around him, the control tower staff worked with professional efficiency to clear other aircraft from the approach path and position emergency vehicles for what could still be a catastrophic landing. "Sarah, we're about 5 miles from the runway now. I need you to look to your right and find a lever with a handle that says landing gear. Can you see it?" "Yes, I found it." "Pull that lever down until you hear 3 clicks. The aircraft is going to shake a little bit, and you'll hear some mechanical sounds. That's normal." "Okay, it's down." "I heard the clicks, and there are 3 green lights now." "Perfect. Those green lights mean the landing gear is locked in position. Now we need to slow the aircraft down. Sarah, look at the instrument panel and find a display that shows your airspeed. It should be a number around 160 or 170. It says 168. Harold made some quick calculations. The aircraft was configured properly for landing, on the correct approach path, and at the right speed. Sarah had proven to be a remarkably apt student under pressure, following instructions with precision and maintaining her composure despite the extraordinary circumstances. But landing a commercial airliner was the most challenging part of flying, requiring split-second timing, precise control inputs, and a kind of feel for the aircraft that normally took years to develop. Harold had done it thousands of times in military aircraft, but never by remote control, never through the hands of someone who had never flown before. Sarah, we're about to begin the final approach. This is the most important part, and I need you to listen to every word I say and do exactly what I tell you. The runway is straight ahead of you. Can you see it? Yes, I can see the runway. It looks really small from up here. That's normal. Sarah, I need you to understand something. You're about to do something that most people could never do. You're going to land a commercial airliner and save 127 lives. I'm going to be with you every step of the way, and we're going to do this together. Harold's hands moved unconsciously as he talked Sarah through the final approach, his muscle memory guiding phantom controls, while he verbally flew the aircraft from control tower. Around him, emergency vehicles raced into position. Foam trucks prepared to spray the runway, and paramedics staged for potential casualties. But Harold's attention was focused entirely on the voice of the flight attendant who had become his co-pilot across impossible odds. Sarah, you're doing beautifully. The runway is getting bigger now. When I tell you, I need you to pull back very gently on the yoke. Just a little bit. We're going to flare the aircraft just before touchdown. Okay, I'm ready. Stand by. Stand by. Now, Sarah, pull back gently on the yoke. United Flight 447 touched down on runway 10, R, at O'Hare International Airport, with all the grace of a commercial airliner flown by a 20-year veteran. The landing was smooth, controlled, and precisely on the center line, a textbook example of how the procedure should be executed. Harold keyed the microphone one last time. Sarah, you did it. Apply the brakes gently and let the aircraft slow down naturally. Emergency vehicles are standing by to assist you. The silence in the control tower lasted for about 5 seconds before everyone started talking at once. Controllers were coordinating with ground vehicles. Supervisors were making reports to federal authorities, and someone was already calling for the media relations team. But Harold Morrison, taxi driver and former Navy captain, simply set down the microphone, walked quietly out of the control tower, and headed back to his beat-up Crown Victoria to resume his shift. The aftermath of United Flight 447's emergency landing unfolded with the kind of media tension and bureaucratic complexity that Harold had spent 8 years trying to avoid. Within an hour, news crews were swarming O'Hare International Airport. Federal investigators were securing the aircraft and interviewing witnesses, and aviation experts were trying to understand how a flight attendant with no flying experience had successfully landed a commercial airliner. Harold had made it halfway back to his taxi when Janet Kowalski, the tower's supervisor, caught up with him in the parking lot. Captain Morrison, wait. Harold stopped walking and turned around slowly. He'd been hoping to disappear before anyone started asking the kinds of questions that would require him to explain who he really was and why he'd been driving a taxi instead of working in aviation. Ma'am. Janet was slightly out of breath from running across the tarmac. Captain, where you going? The FAA investigators want to debrief you. The media wants to interview you. And the airline executives are flying in from Chicago to meet the pilot who saved their aircraft. Harold adjusted his Yankees cap and looked back toward the terminal, where United Flight 447 was surrounded by emergency vehicles and investigators. Ma'am, I'm not the pilot who saved that aircraft. Sarah Mitchell is. I just talked her through the procedures over the radio. Captain Morrison, what you did in there was extraordinary. I've been working air traffic control for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that. You took an impossible situation and made it look routine. Harold was quiet for a moment, considering his response. The truth was that landing Flight 447 hadn't felt routine at all. It had felt like coming home. For 40 minutes, he'd been Captain Harold Morrison again, using skills and knowledge that had been dormant for 8 years but had never truly faded. Mrs. Kowalski, I appreciate your kind words, but I need to get back to work. I got fares waiting, and people depend on me to be there. Janet stared at him in disbelief. Captain, you just saved 127 lives. You can't seriously be planning to go back to driving a taxi like nothing happened. Harold smiled sadly. Ma'am, I've been driving a taxi for 8 years. That's my job now. What happened today was just temporary duty. Harold was walking away again when Janet called after him one more time. Captain Morrison, why? Why are you driving a taxi when you could be flying? Harold stopped but didn't turn around. Because sometimes, Mrs. Kowalski, the most qualified person for a job is the one nobody expects to be able to do it. By the time Harold reaches Crown Victoria, his radio was crackling with fare requests from passengers who needed rides from O'Hare to destinations around Chicago. He checked his logbook, noted that he'd been out of service for 43 minutes, and started the engine. But as Harold pulled out of the parking lot, he could see United Flight 447 in his rear-view mirror, surrounded by emergency vehicles and investigators who were trying to understand how a routine flight had become an extraordinary rescue. And for just a moment, Harold allowed himself to remember what it had felt like to be the person everyone was counting on to make the impossible happen. Then he picked up his radio microphone and returned to being Harold Morrison, taxi driver. Dispatch, Car 47 is back in service and available for fares. The media coverage of United Flight 447's emergency landing dominated the Chicago news for 3 days. Sarah Mitchell, the flight attendant who had landed the aircraft, became an instant celebrity, appearing on national television to describe her harrowing experience and praise the mysterious pilot who had talked her through the landing from the control tower. I owe my life to Captain Morrison, Sarah told a CNN reporter during a live interview. I've never been so scared in my life, but his voice was so calm and confident. He made me believe that we could do it, even when I was sure we were all going to die. The reporters pressed for details about the pilot who had provided the radio guidance, but airport officials were remarkably vague about Harold's identity and background. They confirmed that a retired military pilot had assisted with the emergency, but they declined to provide his name or contact information, citing privacy concerns and ongoing federal investigations. Harold watched the coverage from his studio apartment above Luigi's Pizza, sipping instant coffee and feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the attention that the incident was generating. Every news report mentioned the mysterious pilot who had saved Flight 447, and Harold knew it was only a matter of time before someone identified him, and his quiet life as a taxi driver became public knowledge. That moment came on Thursday morning, when Margaret Chin climbed into Harold's taxi for her usual ride home from Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Harold, she said as soon as she settled into the back seat, I need to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Harold adjusted his rear-view mirror and pulled away from the hospital, but he could see Margaret's reflection watching him intently. What's on your mind, Mrs. Chun? Were you the pilot who saved that United flight on Monday? Harold was quiet for several seconds, navigating the morning traffic with his usual precision while considering how to respond. He'd known this moment would come eventually. Margaret was too observant and too intelligent to miss the connections between Harold's knowledge of aviation and the mysterious pilot who had appeared at O'Hare just when he was needed most. What makes you think that, Mrs. Chun? Harold, I've been riding with you for 3 years. I've listened to you talk about aircraft every time we pass the airport. I've seen the way you watch planes take off and land. And on Tuesday morning, you seemed different, more energetic, more alert, like you've been doing something important instead of just driving taxi. Harold pulled into Margaret's driveway in Chinatown and put the taxi in park. In the rear-view mirror, he could see that Margaret's expression was patient but determined, the look of someone who wouldn't be satisfied with evasive answers. Mrs. Chun, what would you say if I told you that sometimes people end up doing jobs that don't reflect their real capabilities? That sometimes the most qualified person in the room is the one everyone assumes couldn't possibly know what they're doing? Margaret leaned forward. I would say that sounds exactly like something you would do. Harold, Hide your light under a bushel, as my grandmother used to say. Harold turned around to face Margaret directly. Mrs. Chun, can I ask you to keep something in confidence? Of course. I was Captain Harold Morrison, United States Navy, for 22 years. I flew F-14 Tomcats off aircraft carriers, completed over 200 combat missions, and trained pilots at the Navy's elite flight schools. I retired 8 years ago with full military honors and a distinguished service record. Margaret's eyes widened, but she didn't seem surprised. And you've been driving taxi ever since? I've been driving taxi because I wanted to disappear into civilian life. Because after 22 years of having people's lives depend on my decisions, I wanted a job where the biggest crisis would be a traffic jam or a difficult passenger. But on Monday, when that flight was in trouble, 127 people needed someone who knew how to land an aircraft in an emergency situation. And I happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills. Margaret was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Harold, why are you still driving taxi? After what you did on Monday, you could work for any airline in the country. You could be training pilots, working as a consultant, doing something that actually uses your experience and expertise. Harold smiled sadly. Mrs. Chun, do you know what the hardest part of military service is? No, it's not the combat or the long deployments or the physical demands. It's the constant pressure of knowing that people are counting on you to make life and death decisions every single day. It's the weight of responsibility that never goes away, even when you're off duty. Harold paused, looking out at the quiet street in Chinatown where Margaret lived. When I retired, I wanted to find a job where nobody's life would depend on my performance, where I could just be a normal person doing normal work without carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. But Harold, you're wasting your talents. You have skills that could save lives, train the next generation of pilots, contribute to aviation safety. How can you justify driving taxi when you could be doing so much more? Harold was quiet for a long moment before responding. Mrs. Chun, on Monday morning, I was exactly where I needed to be, with exactly the right skills, at exactly the right time to save 127 lives. If I had been working for an airline or a training facility, I wouldn't have been at O'Hare when Flight 447 declared an emergency. Margaret's expression changed as she realized what Harold was saying. You think it was meant to happen that way? I think that sometimes the most important thing you can do is be in the right place when you're needed, even if nobody expects you to be the person who can help. Margaret paid her fare and stepped out of the taxi. But before closing the door, she leaned down to speak to Harold one more time. Harold, what you did on Monday was extraordinary. But what you do every day, treating people with dignity, providing reliable service, being a steady presence in a chaotic world, that's extraordinary too. Don't let anyone tell you that your work doesn't matter. Harold watched Margaret walk to her front door and disappear inside her house. Then he picked up his radio microphone and returned to the work of being Harold Morrison, taxi driver, who happened to know how to land airplanes when the situation required it. The phone call came 3 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, when Harold was taking a break between fares at the O'Hare staging area. He'd been sitting in his usual spot, watching aircraft take off and land, while eating a sandwich from the airport deli, when his cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Hello, Captain Morrison? This is Sarah Mitchell. I was the flight attendant on United 447. Harold nearly dropped a sandwich. Since the emergency landing, he'd wondered how Sarah was doing, whether she'd experienced any trauma from the incident, whether she'd been able to return to her normal duties as a flight attendant. Sarah, it's good to hear from you. How are you doing? Captain Morrison, I'm doing well. Thanks to you, I want to call and thank you personally for what you did that day. You saved my life and the lives of 126 other people. Sarah, you're the one who saved those lives. You kept your composure under incredible pressure and executed every procedure perfectly. You should be proud of what you accomplished. There was a pause before Sarah responded. Captain Morrison, I need to ask you something. Why haven't you done any interviews about what happened? The media has been trying to find you for weeks, and the airline executives want to meet with you. You're a hero, but you seem to be avoiding any recognition. Harold watched a United Airlines 737 taxi toward the runway, the same model aircraft that Sarah had landed 3 weeks earlier. Sarah, I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who was in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge. You're the one who had the courage to sit in that cockpit and trust a stranger's voice over the radio. But Captain Morrison, I found out who you are. I found out about your military service record. You're not just some retired pilot. You're one of the most decorated naval aviators in recent history. Top Gun graduate, combat veteran, test pilot. Why are you driving a taxi instead of working in aviation? Harold was quiet for several seconds, watching ground crews prepare aircraft for departure. Sarah, can I ask you something? When you went back to work as a flight attendant after the emergency landing, did it feel different? Yes, completely different. Every time I walk onto an aircraft now, I understand how complex and sophisticated these machines are. I appreciate the skill and training that goes into being a pilot, and I have a much deeper respect for the responsibility that comes with keeping passengers safe. That's exactly why I drive a taxi instead of flying commercially, Sarah. After 22 years of military flying, I understand the weight of that responsibility better than most people. Every decision you make in the cockpit affects the lives of everyone on board. It's a burden that some people carry easily and others find overwhelming. But you handled our emergency perfectly. You made it look effortless. Harold smiled. Sarah, it wasn't effortless at all. For those 40 minutes, I was carrying the weight of 127 lives, just like I did for 22 years in the military. And when it was over, I remembered why I chose to step away from that kind of responsibility. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Captain Morrison, do you ever miss it? Flying, I mean. Harold looked up at the sky, where aircraft were taking off every few minutes, carrying passengers to destinations around the world. Every single day, Sarah. But missing something and being ready to take on that responsibility again are two different things. What if I told you that United Airlines wants to offer you a position as a training instructor, teaching emergency procedures to pilots and flight attendants? Harold was surprised by the offer, but not tempted by it. That's very generous, Sarah, but I'm content with my current job. Captain Morrison, with respect, you're wasting your talents driving a taxi. You have knowledge and experience that could prevent future emergencies, could save lives, could make aviation safer for everyone. Harold considered this for a moment. Sarah, let me ask you something. If you had known, before you became a flight attendant, that someday you might have to land an aircraft in an emergency, would you have taken the job? I don't know. Probably not. But you did take the job, and when the moment came, you had the courage and competence to save 127 lives. Sometimes the most valuable people are the ones who end up in positions where nobody expects them to have extraordinary capabilities. Sarah was quiet for several seconds. You're saying that driving a taxi keeps you ready for the unexpected. I'm saying that I'm exactly where I need to be, doing exactly what I need to do, until the moment comes when I need to be something else. After Sarah ended the call, Harold sat in his taxi for a few more minutes, watching aircraft operations at O'Hare International Airport. Then he started his engine, checked his radio for fare requests, and returned to the work of being Harold Morrison, taxi driver, who happened to be ready for anything. 6 months after United Flight 447's emergency landing, Harold Morrison was still driving the same beat-up Crown Victoria taxi through the streets of Chicago. The media attention had eventually faded, the federal investigation had been completed, and life had returned to its normal routine of early morning pickups, airport runs, and quiet conversations with regular passengers like Margaret Chen. But some things had changed in ways that only Harold fully understood. The first change was internal. For 8 years, Harold had successfully buried Captain Harold Morrison beneath the ordinary routine of taxi driving. But 40 minutes of flying Flight 447 by remote control had awakened something that couldn't be put back to sleep. Harold found himself paying closer attention to aviation radio frequencies, studying weather patterns with the eye of a pilot rather than a ground-based observer, and mentally flying approaches every time he dropped passengers at O'Hare. The second change was external. Word spread through Chicago's aviation community about the taxi driver who had saved Flight 447, and Harold began noticing subtle differences in how he was treated at the airport. TSA agents who had never acknowledged his existence now nodded respectfully when they saw him. Air traffic controllers occasionally waved from the tower when Harold was in the staging area. Even airline pilots, waiting for crew transport, would sometimes strike up conversations about flying that went far beyond casual small talk. Harold was thinking about these changes on a cold December morning when his routine was interrupted by an unusual fare request. Instead of the standard pickup at a hotel or residence, Harold received a call to meet a passenger at a small private aviation facility on the far side of O'Hare's complex. The address led Harold to Signature Flight Support, a fixed-base operator that served corporate jets and private aircraft. Harold had never picked up a fare from this location before, and he was surprised to see a well-dressed woman in her 50s waiting outside the facility with a small suitcase. "Are you Harold?" the woman asked as she approached the taxi. "Yes, ma'am. You called for a ride to downtown Chicago." "Actually, Mr. Morrison, I called specifically for you." Harold felt a familiar wariness settle over him. Ever since the Flight 447 incident, he'd been approached by reporters, aviation consultants, and curious members of the public who had somehow connected him to the emergency landing. Most of these encounters ended with Harold politely declining interviews or job offers and returning to his normal routine. "Ma'am, if this is about the United flight from 6 months ago, I don't give interviews or discuss operational details." The woman smiled and climbed into the back seat of Harold's taxi. "Mr. Morrison, my name is Patricia Williams, and I'm the chief pilot for Midwest Corporate Aviation. I'm not here as a reporter or curiosity seeker. I'm here because I have a proposition that might interest you." Harold started the taxi and began driving toward downtown Chicago, but his attention was focused on Patricia Williams's reflection in the rear-view mirror. She carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and her mention of being a chief pilot suggested she understood aviation at a professional level. "What kind of proposition, Ms. Williams?" "Mr. Morrison, I know who you are. Not Harold Morrison, the taxi driver, but Captain Harold Morrison, former Navy test pilot, Top Gun graduate, and one of the most respected aviators of your generation. I also know that you spent the last 8 years deliberately avoiding any connection to commercial aviation." Harold's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "Ms. Williams, I'm retired from flying. I drive a taxi now, and I'm content with that choice." "I'm sure you are, Captain. But I'm not here to offer you a flying job. I'm here to offer you something different." Patricia leaned forward slightly, and Harold could see in the mirror that she was choosing her words carefully. "Captain Morrison, Midwest Corporate Aviation operates a fleet of business jets for corporate clients. Most of our flights are routine, executives traveling between cities, time-sensitive cargo deliveries, that sort of thing. But occasionally, we get requests for more challenging missions." "What kind of challenging missions?" "Medical evacuations from remote locations. Humanitarian relief flights at areas with damaged airports. Emergency transport for critical personnel. The kind of flying that requires not just technical skill, but judgment, experience, and the ability to make life-and-death decisions under pressure." Harold was intrigued despite himself. "And you think I'd be interested in this kind of work?" "Captain Morrison, 6 months ago you talked a flight attendant through landing a commercial airliner in an emergency situation. You made split-second decisions that saved 127 lives, and you did it with a kind of calm competence that only comes from decades of experience in crisis situations." Patricia paused, allowing Harold to process this information. "We don't need you to fly scheduled routes or transport business executives to meetings. We need someone who can handle the missions that other pilots won't take, the flights that require someone with your background and capabilities." Harold pulled into downtown Chicago and stopped at the address Patricia had provided. The offices of a major law firm in the Loop. But instead of getting out immediately, Patricia waited for Harold's response. "Ms. Williams, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not ready to take on that kind of responsibility again. The United flight was a one-time situation, and I was lucky that it worked out as well as it did." Patricia smiled. "Captain Morrison, luck had nothing to do with it. You saved those lives because you had the skills, experience, and judgment to handle an impossible situation. Those capabilities don't disappear just because you drive a taxi instead of flying aircraft." She handed Harold a business card. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer, but I want you to know that when you're ready to use your flying skills for something meaningful again, we have missions that could really use someone with your capabilities." After Patricia left, Harold sat in his taxi for several minutes, looking at the business card and thinking about her offer. The idea of flying again, not just flying, but flying missions that mattered, that helped people, that used the skills for purposes beyond profit or convenience, was more appealing than he wanted to admit. But Harold had spent 8 years learning to live without the weight of constant responsibility, without the pressure of making decisions that affected other people's lives. Going back to that world, even in a limited capacity, would mean accepting that weight again. Harold put the business card in his wallet and returned to his radio to check for the next fare. But for the rest of the day, he found himself thinking about Patricia Williams's proposition and wondering whether he was ready to be Captain Harold Morrison again, even part-time. The decision came 3 weeks later, when Harold received a call that would change everything. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Friday night, and Harold was parked outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital, waiting for Maverick to finish her shift, when a cell phone rang with Patricia Williams's number. "Harold, this is Patricia Williams from Midwest Corporate Aviation. I know it's late, but we have an emergency situation, and I need to know if you're available." Harold was immediately alert. Emergency calls at 2:30 a.m. usually meant life and death situations. "What's the situation, Ms. Williams?" "We have a 12-year-old girl in Duluth, Minnesota, who needs immediate transport to Children's Hospital in Chicago for emergency surgery. She was in a car accident, has severe internal injuries, and the local hospital doesn't have the surgical capabilities to save her life." Harold felt the familiar sensation of time slowing down and priorities crystallizing that he remembered from military emergency situations. "What's the weather situation in Duluth?" "That's the problem, Harold. There's a severe winter storm moving through northern Minnesota. Commercial aviation is grounded, and the 2 pilots we had available both declined the flight as too dangerous." Harold was already mentally calculating flight times, fuel requirements, and weather alternatives. "Ms. Williams, what kind of aircraft are we talking about?" "A Cessna Citation X. It's fast, reliable, and equipped for instrument flight in severe weather, but it requires a pilot with experience in challenging conditions." Harold looked out at the snow that was beginning to fall in Chicago and made a decision that surprised him. "Ms. Williams, I'll take the mission." There was a pause before Patricia responded. "Harold, are you sure? This isn't a routine flight. The weather is marginal. The airport in Duluth has limited instrument approaches and will be operating under significant time pressure. Ms. Williams, a 12-year-old girl is going to die if someone doesn't get her to Chicago tonight. I've flown in worse conditions than this, and I've never failed to complete a mission when lives were at stake. Harold, you haven't flown commercially in 8 years. Are you certain you're ready for this?" Harold thought about the question for exactly 3 seconds. "Ma'am, I've been ready for this my entire adult life. Some skills don't rust." 90 minutes later, Harold Morrison was back in the pilot seat of an aircraft for the first time in 8 years. The Cessna Citation X was a sophisticated business jet with advanced avionics and weather radar, but the fundamental principles of flying hadn't changed. Harold ran through the pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of someone for whom aviation procedures were as natural as breathing. Patricia Williams had insisted on flying as his co-pilot, both to provide assistance and to evaluate Harold's performance in case future missions became available. As they taxied toward the runway at Chicago Executive Airport, Patricia watched Harold's movements and procedures with the critical eye of a chief pilot assessing a new hire. "Harold, when was the last time you flew a citation?" "Never," Harold replied, adjusting his headset and checking the weather radar display. but I've flown aircraft with similar systems, and the principles are the same regardless of the specific airplane. Patricia looked concerned. Harold, maybe we should. Ms. Williams, we have a 12-year-old girl who needs emergency surgery, and we're burning time on the ground. I'm qualified to fly this aircraft, and I'm ready to complete this mission. Harold's voice carried the calm authority that Patricia remembered from their first conversation in his taxi. This wasn't Harold Morrison, the taxi driver, anymore. This was Captain Harold Morrison, military aviator, preparing to execute a mission under challenging conditions. The flight to Duluth took 2 hours through weather conditions that would have grounded most civilian aircraft. Harold navigated around thunderstorms, managed icing conditions, and executed an instrument approach to Duluth International Airport in visibility that was barely above minimums. But what impressed Patricia most wasn't Harold's technical flying skills. It was his decision-making under pressure, his calm communication with air traffic control, and the way he managed risk while maintaining focus on the mission objective. When they landed in Duluth, an ambulance was waiting on the tarmac with the 12-year-old patient and her parents. The little girl was unconscious, connected to portable life support equipment, and clearly in critical condition. Harold helped load the patient into the aircraft, while Patricia coordinated with the medical team and air traffic control for immediate departure. As they prepared for takeoff, Harold could see the girl's parents in the cabin, holding their daughter's hand and praying quietly. The flight back to Chicago was faster but equally challenging, as Harold had to balance speed with the safety requirements of transporting a critical patient. He landed at Chicago Executive Airport at 6:47 a.m., where another ambulance was waiting to transport the girl to Children's Hospital. As the ambulance drove away with its precious cargo, Patricia turned to Harold with an expression of profound respect. Harold, that was extraordinary flying. I've been a pilot for 25 years, and I've never seen someone handle challenging conditions with that level of skill and composure. Harold was securing the aircraft and completing post-flight procedures, but Patricia could see that something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. For 8 years, Harold had been hiding his capabilities behind the ordinary routine of taxi driving. But 2 flights in challenging conditions had awakened the aviator who had never really retired. Ms. Williams, when do you have the next mission? Patricia smiled. Harold, are you ready to come back to flying? Harold looked up at the sky. Where the winter storm was beginning to clear and aircraft were resuming normal operations. For 8 years, he'd been telling himself that he was content driving a taxi, that he didn't miss the responsibility and pressure of being a pilot. But 6 hours of flying missions that mattered had reminded him who he really was and what he was capable of accomplishing. Ms. Williams, I'm ready to be useful again. Harold Morrison never went back to driving taxi full-time. Over the following months, he transitioned into a new role as Midwest Corporate Aviation's chief pilot for emergency and humanitarian missions. He kept his taxi license active and his Crown Victoria registered, but most of his time was spent flying aircraft on missions that required someone with his unique combination of skills and experience. The work was exactly what Harold had been missing without realizing it. Medical evacuations from remote locations, relief flights to disaster areas, emergency transport for critical personnel and time-sensitive cargo. The kind of flying that reminded Harold why he had become a pilot in the first place. Not for glory or recognition, but for the opportunity to use extraordinary skills in service of ordinary people who needed help. Margaret Chin was Harold's first passenger in his new role as a humanitarian pilot. When her elderly father suffered a heart attack during a family vacation in rural Wisconsin, the local hospital couldn't provide the cardiac surgery he needed to survive. Harold flew Margaret and her father to Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, where the surgical team was able to save the man's life. Harold, Margaret said as they waited in the hospital after her father's successful surgery, I always knew you were capable of more than driving taxi, but I never imagined you were capable of this. Harold smiled. Mrs. Chun, I spent 8 years trying to be ordinary because I thought I was tired of being responsible for other people's lives. But what I learned is that some people are meant to carry that weight, and when they try to set it down, they discover that the weight was actually what gave their lives meaning. 6 months after Harold's return to flying, Sarah Mitchell called him with news about her own career transition. "Captain Morrison, I wanted you to know that I've been accepted into United Airlines pilot training program. After what happened on Flight 447, I realized that I wanted to learn how to really fly, not just be a passenger who got lucky in an emergency." Harold was delighted by the news. "Sarah, that's outstanding. You're going to be an excellent pilot." "Captain Morrison, I wouldn't be doing this if you hadn't shown me what was possible that day. You didn't just save our lives. You showed me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have the right guidance and support. Sarah, you had the courage to trust a stranger's voice over the radio and land an aircraft you'd never flown before. That kind of courage is exactly what makes a great pilot." After Sarah ended the call, Harold sat in the pilot's lounge at Chicago Executive Airport, looking out at the aircraft that he now flew on missions around the country. The Cessna Citation X, a Pilatus PC-12 for shorter flights, and a King Air 350 for missions that required special equipment or additional range. Harold Morrison had spent 8 years hiding his light under a bushel, pretending to be an ordinary taxi driver, when he was actually one of the most skilled aviators of his generation. But sometimes the most important journey isn't the one that takes you somewhere new. It's the one that brings you back to who you were always meant to be. And sometimes the person who seems the least capable of helping you is actually the one who's been waiting his entire life for the moment when his skills would be needed to save the day. Harold picked up his flight bag and headed toward the Citation X for his next mission, a medical evacuation flight to Montana, where a critically injured rancher needed immediate transport to a trauma center in Denver. It was exactly the kind of challenging, meaningful work that had convinced Harold to return to flying. As Harold completed his pre-flight inspection, he thought about the businessman who had ridiculed him 6 months earlier for being just a taxi driver with no ambition. That passenger had been wrong about almost everything, but he'd been right about one thing. Some people are born to be leaders, and others are born to serve. Harold Morrison had been born to serve, whether that meant driving a taxi, talking a flight attendant through an emergency landing, or flying humanitarian missions to places where his skills could save lives. The vehicle didn't matter. What mattered was being ready when people needed help, and having the skills to make the impossible possible. Harold climbed into the pilot's seat, started the engines, and prepared for takeoff. Somewhere in Montana, a critically injured rancher was counting on Harold to get him to a trauma center that could save his life. It was exactly the kind of responsibility that Harold had spent 8 years trying to avoid, and exactly the kind of mission that reminded him why he'd become a pilot in the first place. Some skills are never lost. Some warriors never truly retire. They just find new ways to serve, new missions to complete, and new lives to save. And sometimes, when the moment is exactly right, and the need is exactly urgent enough, the quiet man in the corner who nobody notices turns out to be exactly the hero everyone needs.